Welcome, students, to this new chapter, The Enemy. The chapter is from the book Vistas. The chapter is written by R.R.B. Now, let us start with the introduction to this story. It is a thought provoking story which highlights how a doctor's duty as a trained medical practitioner towards a patient makes him rise above narrow national prejudice. He risks his honor, position, and life as well as that of his wife and children by sheltering a runaway prisoner of war of the enemy camp and saving his life. The conflict in the doctor's mind as a private individual and as a citizen with a sense of national loyalty is beautifully portrayed. So, let us begin with the story. The story is during the World War. An American prisoner of war is washed ashore in a dying state and is found at the doorstep of a Japanese doctor. Should he save him as a doctor or hand him over to the enemy army as a patriot? So, this was the conflict in his mind, that whether he should save the enemy or he should hand over the patient to the army as a patriot. So now let us see what happens in this story. Dr. Sadao Hoki's house was built on a spot of the Japanese coast where a little boy he had often played. So, the doctor's name is Sadao Hoki. He lived near a coast of the and where he was born and brought up. This was his house where he played during his childhood. The low square stone house was set upon rocks well above a narrow beach that was outlined with bent pines. So his house was built upon the rocks and there were many pine trees. As a boy, Sadao had climbed the pines, supporting himself on his bare feet, as he had seen men do in the South Seas. So, Sadao also climbed the pine trees when he was a boy. When they climbed and he learned it from those people who climbed the coconut trees. His father taken him often to the islands of those seas, and never had he failed to say to the little brave boy at his side, "Those island yonders, they are the stepping stones to the future of Japan." So, Sadao's father used to often take Sadao with him to the islands, and he used to motivate him by showing him those men who used to climb the coconut trees and used to say that these yonders are the future of Japan. Where shall we step from them? Sadao had asked seriously. Who knows? His father had answered. Who can limit our future? It depends. Sadao had taken this into his mind, as he had everything his father said. His father, who never joked or played with him, but who spent infinite pains upon him who was his only son. So Sadao was the only son of his father, and his father was quite a serious man, and he never joked or played with Sadao but often motivated him for the future. Sadao knew that his education was his father's chief concern. As all of you have a father who says that you should study, in the same way, Sadao's father also told Sadao that he should only be educated, and that was his only concern. For this reason, he had been sent at 22 to America to learn all that could be learned of surgery and medicine. So, at the age of 22, Sadao was sent to America to study surgery and medicine. He had come back at 30. So, Sadao came back to his motherland when he was almost 30 years old. And before his father died, he had seen Sadao become famous not only as a surgeon but also as a scientist. So Sadao completed his studies and he came to his motherland, and when he came back, his father was quite old and he died. He had seen Sadao become, but the only thing was that Sadao's father saw that Sadao had become a very famous doctor and a scientist. Because he was perfecting a discovery which would render wounds entirely clean, he had not been sent abroad with the troops also. So, this Sadao, he was working on a very nice project where if there was any wound, the wound would be entirely clean. This was the discovery he was making. He had not been sent abroad with the troops. So he was not sent as a soldier with the troops to fight. He knew there was some slight danger that the old general might need an operation for a condition for which he was now being treated medically, and for this possibility Sadao was being kept in Japan. So Sadao was a good surgeon and he was not sent with the army because the general had been operated and perhaps Sadao was needed for the treatment of the general. Clouds were rising from the ocean now. The unexpected warmth of the past few days had at night drawn heavy fog from the cold waves. So the weather was very cold and there was fog everywhere. Sadao watched mist hide outlines of a little island near the shore and then come creeping up the beach below the house, withering around the pines. So Sadao was going to the shore and seeing the beautiful climate. The clouds were rising, the fogs formed a mist, and his house, the island, the beaches, all were hidden in the mist. In a few minutes, fog would be wrapped about the house too, and within a few minutes, the fog also engulfed the house he lived. They could not see his house also. Then he would go into the room where Hana, his wife, would be waiting for him with the two children. So after seeing these beautiful things, he went into his room where his wife and children were waiting for him. But at this moment, the door opened and she looked out. A blue woolen heroi over her kimono. She came to him affectionately. What is haori? Haori is a type of woolen garment which is worn over the Japanese dress called kimono. to him affectionately and put her arm around through his as he stood, smiled and said nothing. So they both were putting their arms over each other and they did not talk anything but stood smiling. He had met Hana in America, but he had waited to fall in love with her until he was sure she was Japanese. So, this lady, his wife Hana, whom he met at America, was waiting to fall in love until he came to know that this lady was also a Japanese. His father would never receive her unless she had been pure in her race. So the Japanese, they follow the race, and he knew that his father won't accept this lady as his wife or daughter-in-law if she was not a pure in her race. He wondered often whom he would have married if he had not met Hana. So he was very much in love with Hana, and he wondered if he had not met Hana, whom would he marry, because he loved Hana very much and she was really a beautiful and wife, and by what luck he had found her in the most casual way by chance, literally, at an American professor's house. So, where they met each other, it was an American professor's house where he saw Hana for the first time, and that too by chance. The professor and his wife had been kind people, anxious to do something for their new foreign students. So the professor was also a good man, and he always wanted to help the students who came from faraway land. So, though bored had accepted this kindness, Sadao had often told Hana how nearly he had not gone to Professor Halley's house that night. So he explains, Sadao explains to Hana, he did not go to the Professor Halley's house that night. The rooms were so small, food so bad, the professor's wife so voluble. But he had gone, and there he had found Hana, a new student, and had felt he would love her if it were at all possible. Though he did not like the professor's house, the food was not good. They had a very small room, and he never wanted to visit the professor's house, but still he had to. And that was the day when he met Hana, another foreign student. But he had gone, and there he had found Hana. So it was his luck that he found Hana where he never wanted to visit. Now he felt her hand on his arms and was aware of the pleasure it gave him. Even though they had been married years enough to have the two children, for they had not married heedlessly in America. So they did not marry in America. When they returned back to Japan, only then they got married. But it was long enough because they already had two children. So it was quite a long time they had been married. They had finished their work at school and had come home to Japan. So now they returned to Japan from America after finishing their studies. And when his father had seen her, the marriage had been arranged in the old Japanese way. So the marriage had taken place in Japan and they married in the Japanese way. Although Sadao and Hana had talked everything over beforehand. They were perfectly happy. She laid a cheek against his arm. It was this moment that both of them saw something black come out of the mist. So they were still standing at the beach and talking to each other while they saw something, some figure like coming out from the foggy and misty atmosphere. It was a man. He was flung up out of the ocean. So this was a figure of a man who had come out of the ocean. It seemed to his feet by a breaker. He staggered a few steps, so this man was not at all healthy. He must have been wounded and he could not walk properly. He staggered a few steps, his body outlined against the mist, so they could not see the man clearly, but the figure of the man could be seen in the mist, his arms above his head. Then the curled mist hid him again. So they saw the figure, but the mist again hid the soldier or the man, wounded man. It was this moment that both of them saw something black out of the mist. It was a man. He was flung up out of the ocean. It seemed to his feet by a breaker. He staggered a few steps, his body outlined against the mist, his arms above the head. Then the curled mist hid him again. "Who is that?" Hana cried. She trod Sadav's arms and they both leaned over the railing of the veranda. Now they saw him again. So they were surprised to see a man and they shouted, "Who is that?" Now they saw him again. The man was on his hands and knees, crawling. Then they saw him fall on his face and lie there. So they saw him that this man could not walk properly and he fell back again on his face. "A fisherman, perhaps," Sadav said, "washed from the boat." So they thought he must have been a fisherman who had been washed from the boat. He ran quickly down the steps. Hana came, her white sleeves flying. So Hana was wearing a kimono and the kimono has a wide sleeve and the sleeve was flying. A mile or two away on either side there were fishing villages. So where they were staying there was a fishing village nearby. But there was only the bare and lonely coast, dangerous with rocks. The surf beyond the beach was spiked with rock. Somehow the man had managed to come through them. He must be badly torn. So they saw that this man was badly wounded. They saw when they came towards him that indeed it was so. The sand on one side of him had already a stain of red soaking through. So they saw this man was wounded and he had sand all over his body and the blood had soaked through. "He is wounded," Sadav exclaimed. He made haste to the man who lay motionless. So Sadav saw a wounded man and he ran towards him, his face in the sand, an old cap stuck to his head, soaked with sea water. So his cap was also wet with sea water. He was in wet rags of garments. Now this man was all wet because he was in the water. Sadav stopped, Hana at his side, and turned the man's head. They saw the face. "A white man," Hana whispered. Now they could clearly see the man, and Hana shouted. And Hana whispered, she said, in a very low voice that this is a white man, because white men are found in the European countries. So, yes, it was a white man. The wet cap fell away, and there was his wet yellow hair, long as though for many weeks it had not been cut. So, he had a long hair that was uncut for several months, and upon this young and tortured face was a rough yellow beard. He did not even shave for so many days. He was unconscious and knew nothing that they did for him. So this man was heavily wounded and he was unconscious and they helped him. But he could not know what they did to him. Now Sadao remembered the wound, and with his expert finger he began to search for it. So Sadao knew where the wound was, and he found the wound by searching it with his finger. Blood flowed freshly at his touch. Now the blood was flowing as Sadao had touched his wound. On the right side of his lower back, Sadao saw that a gun wound had been reopened. So Sadao saw how the man was wounded with a gun. The flesh was blackened. The flesh that came out was blackened with powder. Sometimes, many days ago, the man had been shot and had not been tendered. So Sadao came to know that this man had been shot for a long time and nobody helped him. It was bad chance that the rock had stuck the wound, and by chance the rock had struck the wound again, and therefore there was blood coming out. "Oh, how he is bleeding," Hana whispered, again in a solemn voice. The mist screened them now completely. So the mist now had gone and they saw him completely, and at this time of day no one came by. The fisherman had gone home, and even the chance of beachcombers would have considered the day at the end. So it was evening, and when all the fishermen had gone back to their house, there were nobody in the beach. "What shall we do with this man?" they inquired with each other. Sadao muttered, but his trained hands seemed of their own will to be doing what they could to stand a fearful bleeding. He packed the wound with the sea moss. Now he saw the bleeding man, and he took some moss from the sea and he packed the wound with straw the beach. The man moaned with pain in his stupor, but he did not awaken. So the man was in great pain, but he could not keep himself awakened because he was too weak. The best thing that we could do would be to put him back in the sea. So they thought, this is a white man, so what we can do, we just tender his wound and put him back in the sea. Sadao said, answering himself. So this was what Sadao was thinking. Now that the bleeding was stopped for the moment, he stood up and dusted the sand from his hand. Now, so the man got up and dusted the wounds. Yes, undoubtedly that would be best. So Hana said, yes, it is best that put him back in the sea. Said steadily, but she continued to stare down at the motionless man. But this motionless man, he still laid there with pain and wound, and he could not move. So they were both watching this man and thinking what to do with him. If we shelter a white man in our house, we should be arrested. So it was a sin in Japan to shelter a white man, because America and Japan were enemies once upon a time. And if we turn him off as a prisoner, he would certainly die. So Sadao knew that if we keep him in our house, we shall be arrested, and if we put him in a prison, he shall die. The kindest thing would be to put him back into the sea. So they thought it is better to put him back in the sea, and that they will be saved, both of them will be saved. Hana said, but neither of them moved. Hana said that, but neither of them moved. They were starting with a curious repulsion upon the inert figure. Starting with a curious repulsion upon the inert figure. What is he? Hana whispered. There is something about him that looks American, Sadaf said. He took up the battered cap. Yes, they're almost gone. But the faint lettering, a sailor, he said, from an American warship. He spelled it out, U.S. Navy. So on his cap, on the soldier's cap, it was written U.S. Navy. So they could make it out that this man was an American soldier from the warship. The man was a prisoner of war. This man was a prisoner of war. He had escaped. Hana cried softly, and that is why he is wounded. So this man had run away from the army troop, and that's why he was wounded with the gunshot in the back. Sadaf agreed. They hesitated, looking at each other. Then Hana said with resolution, come, we are able to put him back into the sea. If I am able, are you? Sadaf asked. So they thought it is better to put him back into the sea so that nobody will fall in any type of problem. No, Hana said, but if you can do it alone. So Hana said that you should not call anybody for help. It is better you do it yourself. The strange thing is, he said, that if the man were whole, I could turn him over to the police without difficulty. So they thought if the man was not wounded, they would put him in the police. But I care nothing for him. He is my enemy. They said this man is our enemy, and therefore we don't care about him. All Americans are my enemy. And he is only a common fellow. You see how foolish his face is. But since he is wounded, so they did not like the soldier because he was their enemy, because he was an American. But because he was wounded, they did not put him back into the sea. You also cannot throw him back into the sea, Hana said. Then there is only one thing to do. We must carry him into the house. Then finally they decided that they should carry this man into the house. But the servant, she inquired. And there were several servants in the house. So they will see this man, this American man, and they may inform the police. So what happens next, we will see in our next video, and we will see ultimately what this man did, Sadaf did, with the soldier who was wounded.